to Science Minds. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Mirella Dapretto here with us today. So thank you for joining us. And
thank you for having me.
yeah, so we'll just jump into things straight off. So first thing, I'd just love to hear a little bit about your background, what kind of brought you to psychology and neuroscience. I know there was kind of you were trained as a psychologist, and then kind of, I think, early in your kind of early career sort of went into this neuroscientist direction. So I'd love to kind of hear your backstory and what led you to the field.
So I was doing my PhD in developmental psychology, and I think it was in my second year, toward the end of my second year, that I went to a talk by Pat Goldman-Rakish. And it was a little bit off my bread and butter, but it was an eye-opener. I left that talk totally enamored with the brain, and I just told myself I cannot be one of those developmental psychologists that spent her career coming up with big theory that will be proven wrong if you factor in what the knowledge that we have about the brain. And for those of you who may not know, Pat Goldman-Rakish did amazing work with monkeys where they basically figure out that one of the very famous tasks that developmental psychology have been using, that from Piaget, to investigate the concept was the object permanence concept, right? This notion that babies do not have a concept that object exists once they're out of sight. Well, because they no longer reach for the object in one position after it's been moved to another in a well. Her series of studies really prove that it's just because of the development of the prefrontal cortex, the failure to inhibit a prepotent response that has been rewarded when the baby reached in a well. And now even if they know that it's been moved, they cannot inhibit that movement. And so I went and talked to my mentor the following day, and I said, I think I'm going to have to quit the program and start over and get a PhD in neuroscience. And she told me, no. You're not going to do that. You can get a minor in behavioral neuroscience, even if I already completed the requirement for one in cognitive psych, and you can take all the classes that you want to prepare yourself to then study the brain as a postdoc. So I did that, and then I was just lucky. I think it was Woody Allen that said something like 90% of life is being there at the right time or something. And so toward the end of my PhD, just as I was looking for a postdoc, fMRI had just been basically invented. This is how old I am. And I went to another talk where Susan Buchheimer, who had just been hired at UCLA, told us all about this new tool that we had to study the brain. So I went and talked to her after that, and I said, oh my God, it's really something that we can use even with children. And it seems obviously so much better than doing, EEG or the kind of stuff that you could do with typically developing babies or children for that matter. And she told me, yes, absolutely. What are you doing? And I said, well, I'm finishing up. I'm looking for a postdoc. I'm very interested in language development. And she had been doing studies on the neural basis of language too, using PET. And she said, well, I have money for a postdoc in my startup package. Would you like to join me? And I was like, yeah.
That's cool.
And so the rest is history, as they say. And our brain mapping center, when I started, existed only on Blueprint, so it took a couple of years before it materialized, and we were ready to go. So I had somewhat of an extensive postdoc, and I think that benefited me because I had to pivot. But yeah, so that's the story of how I got into studying the brain.
What led you to psychology initially?
That's an interesting question. So I started studying psychology all the way back in Italy at the University of Padua, and it was, oh my God, do I really need to say it? But it was because my first boyfriend had a very crazy mother.
Okay.
And it was clear to pretty much everybody why that it was pretty aberrant, her behavior, but she had her own troubled youth. So she lost her mother when she was 2. She was raised by grandparents. Anyway, the bottom line is that everybody could see why she was doing what she was doing except herself. And I just thought, like, how can a person be so oblivious, and not be able to have any introspections and regulate. And so that's what got me actually interested in how our mind operates, and how some people more than others are not able, to see the motives that underlie their behavior and how they can behave in a more productive ways. But then I also knew once I started that I was never going to be able to be a good clinician, because I guess one of my faults is that I'm not a very patient person. And I also am very transparent, so I'm not able to really hide what I feel very well. And I also realized, and as I started studying psychology, that there were more questions still than there were answers. And a lot of the research obviously was done in the US and England more so than in Italy. When I started, believe it or not, you could only major in psychology in 2 universities in the whole country.
Wow.
So I had my eyes on pursuing research, and that's why I ultimately came to the US.
Yeah. Wow, that's a really interesting backstory. That's great. How do you think that your background in developmental psychology has influenced or shaped your work as a neuroscientist?
Oh, I think I'm very happy that I actually had that background. And when I mentor students that are coming in the neuroscience program, I always send them to take elective courses in psychology, because I feel that our neuroscience program could benefit from having a little bit more of this larger context in view. Because just as I thought that I couldn't be at the moment that psychology doesn't consider about the brain, I also am very wary about studying the brain without taking into consideration the larger context in which development takes place, because obviously it's a very bidirectional relationship, right? And I remember when I started, and there were a lot of some of my colleagues that would think, okay, the brain matures, and as the brain matures, allows for new behaviors to emerge. And I was going like, well, and so they would look at something that changed in the brain, and they would ask me like, what happens, in development at that time that we can say that this change, leads to that behavior. And I was going like, well, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because it could be that some new behaviors that are in the development are actually causing some of the changes that you see in the brain. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? And so I think that has always been in the back of my mind, not to endorse this kind of deterministic thing. Okay, that it's what's some development is just happening, which leads to behavioral change or new capacity, as opposed to think about the role of the environment and the experience, how that shapes brain development. So
for sure, that's really interesting. I mean, you have a lot of these, looking kind of at your, what you publish and your career, you have a lot of areas where you have kind of complementary skills and approaches, like with the developmental psychology and neuroscience, or you look at, young children, but you also look at adolescents. You look at neurotypical people, but also people with developmental disabilities. I'm wondering, kind of across that, especially thinking about like looking at typically developing adolescents and people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, how do those inform one another in your work?
There are reasons why I wear different hats, and while my interests kind of went in different directions, and some of which I'll talk in my talk, and some of it is serendipitous as it happened. But I started out thinking we cannot really understand what goes wrong in development or in the brain, without having a full understanding of how development is supposed to take place, under the best case scenario. And then I started realizing that actually looking at a typical development or developmental condition can actually shed some light itself into what normal or typical, what are the mechanism, okay? So not that a typical behavior is gonna tell you what should be normal, but it can help us understand how development take place and what are the mechanisms that ultimately give rise to, either normal or typical development versus, not so much. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it goes back and forth a lot. But in terms of the different age groups, that I started out working with babies, language development was my thing. So the first 2 years of life are the most important one. And then those days, imaging was a new baby, of course. And so we didn't start with the most difficult part, which is to actually study brain development in infants or toddlers, which is, even more complicated. And so I kind of pivoted toward older kids where, you would say language has already taken place, but at the same time, there are a lot of conditions like autism where you have language delayed and language impairments. And so I thought, okay, I'm still studying language. That's what I thought at the beginning. And then I realized that the problems in autism where it pertains to the realm of language, are really a byproduct of larger problems in terms of social communication. And I got way more interested in that than in language. But then I went full circle back into studies babies, and I think that that's the most rewarding, or the part at least of my life, of my research life, that I cared the most, because it does have the potential, to really allow us to intervene at a time where you're not just trying to ameliorate some problems, but perhaps you could do without these problems fully developing to begin with. So I'm not a clinician, as I said, but I think that a lot of the interventions for older kids or even adolescents are more geared toward giving them new skills, teaching them ways in which they can navigate social interactions, given a different ways, to approach the world. Whereas in babies, we can think about really making changes that would operate from the more of that implicit level, bottom up, so that a person doesn't always have to work harder, to interpret what other people are thinking, feeling, saying, and so on. So.
Another question I have is, so if tomorrow the NIH doubles your funding, what would you do or want to do with that money?
Interesting. Only double.
Triple, quadruple, whatever you want.
Yeah, because unfortunately, what I would do, I think we're already moving right in the direction of much larger studies and multi-site, investigation are now the name of the game. NIH has been given a lot of money to do this massive scale studies, both in older kids. I'm sure you might have heard about the ABCD study, looking at children age 10 all the way to 20, and they now more recently launched the HBCD study, which is in basically babies. They start following mothers when they're pregnant, and we're talking about like 10,000, 7,000 youth, and so that is, I believe, very important. And the problem that I see is that when you're talking about typical development and youth that have some conditions, achieving those large ends it's very, very hard. Yeah. And of course, people have already been endeavoring, for decades to join forces, but you still have a lot of people in Europe doing their things, and then people in the US and Canada doing their things, et cetera. And I think maybe it would be time to join forces in a more concrete way. So I think that spearheading something where all over the world, researchers that are tackling autism or ADHD or something come together, because when you're looking at these larger studies that are already funded, and they do accept, youth that can do the task even if they have autism, et cetera. When you're looking at the numbers of youth that are diagnosed with either autism, ADHD, or something, you go back to those smaller scale numbers that are still perhaps a big limiting factor.
Right.
And then I would like to find a way to bring the technologies, this is like really the pie high up in the skies, where the families are, because I think that we still, even if we tried very hard to get a better sense of what the family life of these participant is and what their environment is, and there are many ways with a lot of tools that we have these days we didn't have 20 years ago that we can get a much better glimpse, but it's still, I think that's still limited versus what we could do. So I'm not into technology development, right? But I would love to have the time to talk to the people who are, to come up with ways in which we can really gather tons of data at minimal cost for the participant, because that's what we care, and then let this information kind of speak for itself, if you will. Because I think science can progress only if there is a continuous interplay between more top-down, okay, I have this hypothesis and I'm going to do a study to verify whether it's right or wrong, but also do some more exploratory study, data-driven, let the data speak for itself. And so you have to have both.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, and the last question I have, which kind of dovetails with this, you talk a little bit about sort of the direction that funding is going and sort of these larger scale multi-center studies. I'm interested to hear what you are excited about looking at kind of the future of the field. If there's anything that is really resonating with you or that you're kind of just excited about.
Okay, well, I think I mentioned earlier that the studies in babies are the most interesting thing right now. And again, I told you why I think that is so. There is such tremendous amount of plasticity in the brain in the first year and the first 2 years of life that I just think one doesn't need to tweak the exposure or create new experiences that you just need a little bit of that to potentially have a tremendous impact on a developmental trajectory, whereas later on it becomes much harder. And I know that I definitely have spoken to folks who said well, ultimately, MRI is not scalable, even if we find, something that would predict with no degree of uncertainty, that a child that showed this type of brain connectivity patterns or whatever is down, is likely to develop problem later on. We're not going to be able to implement this as any kind of screening tools. And I was going but why not? If we're thinking about the cost, the lifetime cost of having a disorder such as autism and for the families and all, I don't know why it would be so hard to envision a scenario where in the future babies, before they're even sent home from the hospital, get a routine short MRI. And I know that, health insurance company are not necessarily gonna like to do that, but babies sleep, all the time when they're newborns, and it's so easy, it's not invasive. And think about if we not only knew for a fact that this baby has a very, very high likelihood of developing some aberrant pattern of behavior, and if the folks who are clinicians, who are developing intervention that can, again, really provide that pivotal, tweak in the environment, then why not? I just don't see it as a pie up in the sky going forward. But we're not there yet. That's for sure. But I do see progress, and I'd like to think that at some point we might be there. And of course, if we find something that it's much easier to do, you know, if we could, and there might be ways. And that's why I always think that doing research that is not relying exclusively on one kind of modality and being able to use, you know, again, a multimodal approach where you're getting data from a variety of sources, it may very well be that we could find some more easily, you know, some other measure that does as good as a job, but we should.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and we're really looking forward to your talk later this evening. So,
all right. Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with the promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.